The talk that I'm presenting to you today is really a work in progress, and it's part of my own spiritual journey. And I've entitled it, Christian Physicians Without Christian Ethics, Have We Chosen to Emulate Daniel or Saul? And I believe that God has directed me in this journey, and that He's taken me down two very disparate paths of thought that He's sort of inexplicably and unexpectedly joined into one consuming idea. The journey began several years ago when my boss, who is openly antagonistic to religion in general, and Christianity in particular, asked me to write a chapter on the social, political, economic, legal, and ethical aspects of infection control. No small task. Subsequently, to fulfill the requirements of an NIH training grant, he asked me to speak on ethics at 2 divisional retreats. I suspect that my boss asked me to do these tasks not because he agreed with me, which he doesn't, but because he felt that he could not be faulted for asking the resident religious fanatic to talk about ethics. Now, since I'm not an ethicist, to prepare for the paper and for the talks, I had to read textbooks on medical ethics, and I read many articles on ethics and epidemiology. And I must confess that these writings oppressed me. I felt that the authors pursued convoluted discussions of the principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and utility, but they would never simply say something was right or wrong. They also did not offer convincing reasons why radical individualists would want to or should act in an ethical manner. And furthermore, the authors never suggested that the ethics might be founded on absolute principles that human beings did not devise. Rather, they indicated that we have only the principles of ethics with which to build the rationale and foundation for our ethics, and from which to formulate answers to specific problems. I found this reasoning ponderous and empty and ultimately dissatisfying. The authors seem to be building elaborate conceptual castles, veritable Neuschwansteins, without foundations. The second part of my journey began last June while my husband and I were flying to Calgary for our second honeymoon in the Canadian Rockies. Time magazine's cover article that week was on prostitution. My emotions while reading the article ranged from horror and anger to sadness and grief to smugness and pride. I was horrified and angry that women and girls were sold or kidnapped into prostitution. I was sad that in Eastern Europe, where economies were in shambles, women chose to prostitute themselves because they could earn more money selling their bodies than they could earn doing more reputable work. And I was smug and self-righteous because I was not in danger of prostituting myself. Then the truth hit me. While I was not in danger of selling my body, I was in danger of prostituting myself. These women chose to sell their bodies so that they could survive. Wasn't I constantly thinking about surviving? Didn't I frequently ask myself what I could do to help myself survive in academic medicine as funding for research and patient care dwindles? As I ruminated on prostitution, I realized that my job was not to ensure my survival. That was God's job. Instead, my job was to obey God and to stop usurping His role in my life. As long as I valued survival above obedience, I was in danger of prostituting myself to the gods of this world, in particular the god of ambition or professional success. As I thought more about ethics and about prostitution, I realized that the two topics were related. As a Christian, I believe that God has given us an absolute foundation for ethics. Yet when we choose survival over obedience, we choose to follow other gods, which God defines as prostitution. And we choose to found our professional and our personal ethics not on God's truth, but on the quicksand of today's shifting values. However, at the time, we do not acknowledge that we are worshiping other gods or that we have shifted our ethical foundation, because we still profess to love and to serve Jesus. Scripture tells the stories of numerous individuals who were faced with similar decisions. Would they obey God and trust Him for their very lives, or would they take matters into their own hands? From this wealth of examples, I have chosen Daniel and Saul to illustrate the point. Daniel and his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were captured by the Babylonians and exiled into the land of Shinar. These young men were without physical defect, of good appearance, trained in every kind of wisdom, well-informed, quick at learning, suitable for service in the palace of the king. The king himself provided them with 3 years of intensive training and with rich food from his own table. Although the provisions must have enticed the captives, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's food. Instead, risking his life, he requested a diet of vegetables and water. Later, Daniel's 3 friends faced a more immediate threat. King Nebuchadnezzar commanded them to bow down and worship his golden statue or be thrown into a fiery furnace, from which he claimed no god could rescue them. They refused, saying, "We do not need to defend ourselves in this manner. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God who we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Finally, when Darius was king, Daniel again had to choose whether he would obey God or protect himself. After Daniel's jealous colleagues coaxed Darius into signing a decree against worshiping anyone other than himself for 30 days, Daniel had to decide whether he would continue to worship God publicly and risk being thrown to the lions, or he would protect himself by worshiping God privately. After all, it was only 30 days, and God would certainly know the intention of his heart. As before, Daniel chose not to protect himself, but to obey God. And again, God blessed Daniel. God chose Saul, a handsome man in the prime of life, to be the first king of Israel. After anointing Saul with oil, Samuel told the new king to go to Gilgal and wait for a prophet who would join him in 7 days to offer holocausts and communion sacrifices. During those 7 days, the Philistines mustered at Michmash. The terrifying sight of 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horses, and a force as numerous as the sand on the seashore caused Saul's men to desert him. As the new king waited, he watched his army, his safety, disintegrate. Desperate to control the situation, Saul offered the Holocaust himself. Immediately the prophet arrived and announced to Saul that because he disobeyed, God would replace Saul with a man after God's own heart. Later, on God's behalf, Samuel commanded Saul to destroy the Amalekites totally. As before, Saul chose to only partially obey. Instead of executing the ban, he saved the king and the best livestock. When Samuel asked, "What is the meaning of this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen I hear?" Saul replied that the people wanted to sacrifice the animals to God. And Samuel exclaimed, "Is the pleasure of God in holocausts and sacrifices, or in obedience to the voice of Yahweh? Yes, obedience is better than sacrifice, submissiveness better than the fat of rams. Rebellion is the sin of sorcery, presumption the crime of teraphim. Since you have rejected the word of Yahweh, he has rejected you as king." How ironic. Daniel, an exile who refused to worship the gods of Babylon and who chose to worship God, was exalted and used by God to influence a pagan culture as he advised and outlived 4 powerful kings. While Saul, the handsome native son who tried to save himself, had his kingdom torn away from him and given to another. Do we live like Daniel, or do we live like Saul? Perhaps we will never be threatened by death either in a fiery furnace or a lion's den if we continue to worship God. Yet every day we must choose whom we will serve. Irina Ratushinskaya, a Christian poetess who was imprisoned in the Soviet Union for her religious and political beliefs, states that her primary goal was to go back to freedom with a clear conscience. And I believe that our goal as Christians and Christian physicians should be to complete our lives and our careers with clear consciences so that we can stand before our God and hear him say, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Yet I fear that many of us have unwittingly prostituted ourselves to the gods of this land. We have chosen to survive or to succeed rather than to obey God. Hence, our lives and our ethics are founded, like those of our non-Christian colleagues, on self and other temporal values, not on God and His eternal truths. To develop truly Christian personal and biomedical ethics, we must first choose to obey God, regardless of the cost. We must then constantly scrutinize our motives, our goals, and our behavior to see whether we are obeying God or are merely saying that we obey Him as we seek to fulfill our own desires. Finally, we must take time to meet with our Master so that He can transform us from prostitutes into faithful servants and from servants into His friends. In the time remaining, I will focus my remarks on the second responsibility, that of scrutinizing our own lives. Although we physicians claim that our primary goal is to relieve human suffering, my own observations suggest that in practice, our primary goal is achieving personal success. For several reasons, I would argue that pursuing achievement is an inadequate and even dangerous goal. Most importantly, as we have seen in the stories of Daniel and Saul, if we seek first to ensure our own survival or security, we may gain the world but lose our souls. God has commanded us to seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. He promised that if we seek Him first, He will give us life. God has nothing good to say about us if we seek our own will first. In fact, He describes this behavior as digging leaky cisterns, working for food that does not satisfy, prostituting ourselves, and seeking after other gods. God is not mocked. If He tells us to take our position, stand still, and see the victory of the Lord on our behalf, He means it. For those of us who find the concept of spiritual prostitution a bit abstract, there are more immediate reasons not to pursue achievement. First, achievement is not permanent. History demonstrates that science changes constantly. Even the most brilliant discoveries will eventually be revised or even supplanted by new observations or theories. I am reminded of a story told by the child psychologist Dr. James Dobson. When he was a young college student, he dreamed of having his name engraved on a large tennis trophy that stood in a prominent showcase. To his great pride and pleasure, he achieved that goal. Years later, while visiting the college, a friend of his found the trophy in a rubble heap. Dr. Dobson concluded ruthfully that life has a way of trashing our trophies. If our only goal is to win trophies, we may come to the end of our lives to discover the truth of the child's song, "Ashes, ashes, all fall down." And as Russell Dinsmore, our friend who's buried under this stone, learned, it probably albeit too late, despite publishing voluminously or even winning the Nobel Prize, we will all die. Okay, you can turn it off. There are, to my knowledge, no studies documenting that the length of one's curriculum vitae correlates with either the length or the quality of one's life. Nor does your CV ensure you safe passage into heaven. Second, if achievement is your highest goal, it will not satisfy you and it could destroy you. If ambition drives you, you will never be contented. You will never have enough success, enough publications, enough grants, enough accolades, enough personal wealth, enough status symbols. This profound dissatisfaction and insecurity leads many physicians to endlessly pursue achievement after achievement, hoping that the next one will satisfy ultimately. Despairing that their own talents and actual accomplishments can fulfill this gnawing need, some physicians are tempted and succumb to by what we euphemistically call scientific misconduct. Others of us merely sell our souls to the devil as we worship the God of success and we drift further and further from worshiping the true God. If we do not maintain a self-critical vigilance, we, like our society, may become more interested in what is useful, marketable, fundable, publishable, and lawful than in what is right. We usually do not change our beliefs quickly or even volitionally. Rather, we slowly replace them as we absorb unawares what William D. Carey, the publisher of Science, called the prevailing external values. We may, in fact, become like Eustace, a nasty little boy in C.S. Lewis's story, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, who realized to his horror that he had turned into a dragon while he was asleep. Sleeping on the dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart, he had become a dragon himself. Now, a well-developed and clearly stated ethical code can help guide our practice, yet it cannot ensure that we behave in an ethical manner. Nor, despite the fond hopes of medical school administrators or scientific society leaders, does reciting or agreeing with such a code inoculate us against temptation. Codes of ethics cannot protect us from prostituting ourselves because they do not change the heart of the matter, whether we choose to obey God. Instead, like the psalmist, we must ask God to examine us to make sure that we do not follow evil ways. We must also search ourselves to determine our real motives. We must ask ourselves whether we are here to serve ourselves or to care for patients and work with colleagues. Are we seeking beneficial knowledge or to merely add to an already padded curriculum vitae while searching for a more exalted position? Are we here to obey God or to secure our own comfort or survival? As difficult as these questions may be, we must ask them or risk a gradual slide into spiritual prostitution and unethical conduct. In the quiet of our consciences, we must grade our answers strictly, guarding against our formidable capacity to rationalize. Anyone intelligent enough to graduate from medical school is intelligent enough to contrive seemingly solid reasons explaining why, in a particular case, gray is as good as white, or yet again, that black seen obliquely and in dim light might understandably be confused with gray. Yet if we heed Robert Cole's warning to be alarmed, even frightened by a kind of scholarly life that goes full steam ahead year after year with no self-criticism, no moral anxiety, no sense of mocking humor with respect to itself, and become a little less likely to betray ourselves morally and with our mind's various strategies. As I stated earlier, this talk has come out of my own spiritual journey. God had a very good reason to send me down this path. I need to learn the lessons. Even as I prepared this talk, I struggled with seeking God's approval and not man's. I was simultaneously writing a book chapter that is 6 months late, a major grant, 2 minor grants, and a myriad of other projects. Each morning I had to decide what I would choose to do first, meet with God or start working. I'm sorry to say that I resembled Saul more closely than I resembled Daniel. And facing you is not nearly as frightening as facing a fiery furnace or the lion's den. In summary, I believe that our ethics flow out of our inner beings, and as such they reflect the state of our hearts and souls. Hence, our ethics are only as strong as our spiritual life, and our spiritual life is only as strong as its foundation. We must examine ourselves to determine whether our lives and our ethics are founded on rock, on sand, or in thin air. We must ask God to examine us, to know our hearts, to probe us, to know our thoughts, to make sure that we do not follow any pernicious ways, and to guide us in the way that is everlasting. Amen. Thank you.
Could you comment a little bit more about the sort of as a physician, trying to think about your work Christianly in the decisions you make with respect to ethical judgments, whether they be in the nature of the research or in, I don't know if you care for patients or if you're doing all research or whatever, but the sense in which you detect this as a hostile environment to your values and the judgments that you make that guide your practice.
Well, I do both research and I see patients. My primary practice in terms of clinical work, it would be mostly with AIDS patients. I would say for me personally, the struggle is to recognize that decisions that I'm making are ethical decisions and not just scientific or medical decisions, but there is an ethical or a spiritual import to them. And because I think in Western society, and I think in academic medicine in particular, we tend to separate sort of the material, physical world from the spiritual world, and to join them and to say that decisions I make about writing a particular grant, or what I will or will not do, what's an important issue to study and to use the public's money on, or what do I do for a particular AIDS patient when we're facing a particular decision. I think the struggle is to see that that has a spiritual implication and an ethical implication. I haven't found any particular resistance to particular decisions that I would make, but I would say that the resistance is at the foundational level. I find that most of my colleagues have absolutely no foundation for the decisions that they make, and they're hostile toward anyone who would say that there is an absolute foundation. For example, in the paper that I wrote, presented to my division, I had just come upon the ethical statement of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, of which I'm a fellow, and I was chagrined and horrified to find that they actually stated in there that there was no absolute, and that the particular ethical statement was only the current sort of consensus of the society at that point. And so that's the kind of environment. Now, when I read this paper to my colleagues, which was really a scathing, and I personally thought it was a scathing indictment of academic medicine as practiced, and I gave a fairly detailed critique of why I thought my society was wrong in its statement about ethics. People applauded this and said, "Oh, this is very eloquent," but they didn't get the point. There was no one who evidenced any discomfort at all while listening to the talk. So I think there's also a level of denial, a level of self-protection that keeps my colleagues from recognizing the problems that they have, or that they may behave in unethical fashions, or that they have no foundation for their ethics. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So at least at this point, I have not faced personal hostility toward me, or have not been threatened with being fired because I don't believe in abortion or something. I'm not an obstetrician and gynecologist, but I clearly sense the undercurrent of opposition to Christian belief that there is an absolute foundation for why we do or do not do things. And in a public institution, I think it's even stronger, because you're legally mandated in some ways that you cannot mention certain things, and you can't talk about Christmas in the public schools in Iowa City.
As I was listening to you, I had great respect for the fact that your spiritual journey included the values and ethics which you outlined. I'm equally aware that there are those physicians who do not share these values and these ethics. How do you find a common ground upon which you can work, upon which you can address some of the very serious social issues of our day? Number two, how can we impact physicians who do not share the Christian or Judeo-Christian ethics, which have a great relevance to the treatment of the individuals with whom they're working?
Well, this isn't, obviously one of the big social issues of our time, but the way I approached this paper for my division was to outline what I thought were the problems with pursuing ambition. I mean, number one, to point out that this is really what I see people doing. They're not really pursuing medical knowledge and care. They're pursuing their own personal ambitions. Maybe they're not getting filthy rich, but they're gaining a lot of accolades and long CVs. And I tried to point out to them, I used a couple of the examples that I used in this particular talk of the trouble you can get into if, regardless of what you believe, you pursue ambition as your primary goal. And then in the discussion of the Infectious Diseases Society of America's ethical code, I pointed out that the framers of that ethical code didn't mean what they said. Because if I chose to plagiarize one of their papers, you can be absolutely sure that one of them would tell me that what I did was wrong. So there are clearly some things that even people who say there's no foundation for ethical behavior say are right and wrong. And then say to them, well, where does that come from, you know? And can we build some sort of consensus that there are some things that are absolutely right and wrong? And so that's kind of the approach I took. It was maybe a bit like the previous speaker who talked about in vitro fertilization, tried to look for the weak points in the secular arguments that I can address as a Christian. Now, in certain personal conversations, I can take that further, and I can say that, you know, as a Christian, this is why I believe this, or why I think this is right or wrong. But in the secular environment, you know, I specifically tried to point out to people, number one, that you need to evaluate your own motives, and number two, you need to really look at whether you believe this statement of ethics and also where it will lead. Because I think statements of ethics like that lead very quickly to political correctness and sort of the thought police to, you know, a police state, sort of. And, you know, you try to get people to say, if this is what you believe, look at where this potentially may lead, and can you live with the consequences of your decisions? I think the vast majority of people, number one, don't criticize their own, they don't look at what their own motives are, and they don't take their own fundamental beliefs to their extremes to see whether or not it will hold them and whether they can tolerate the consequences. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I've been trying to do. The person who's probably influenced me the most and given me the most courage to begin to do this is Ravi Zacharias. And I think I was very timid, but he has really helped me realize that as a Christian, there are strong intellectual, rational arguments that I can use to support what I believe and what I do, and that it's really the non-Christian who has a foundational problem. And I tried to show them that. I think it's only a matter of time when you don't have a solid foundation that the building collapses. And it may take a while, and the building may look perfectly fine now. I mean, my personal view is that our ethics and our lives are founded on personal holiness and our relationship to God, and that foundation is critical. We can be appearing to do the right things, but if the foundation is wrong or shifted, if we are pursuing other gods and really not worshiping God, then we're in trouble. And that if the foundation isn't there, even if the actions at this point appear or, you know, meet the checklist of all the appropriate things, you're in deep trouble. And I think that's the main point of my talk, the main point of my own struggle at this point in my life is to recognize that.
When you are convicted about having put another God in your life instead of the God that you were talking about, how do you get on the road towards rightness?
I think the first thing is, number one, recognizing that we have prostituted ourselves, that God says that any time we put anything first that's not God, it's prostitution. I mean, the Old Testament, I read through a whole series of verses where God uses that word to describe the Israelites and what they've done. And I think we have to learn to take our replacing God by something else as that serious. I mean, most of us would be horrified to think that we could sell our bodies sexually. Are we horrified that we can give up the living God for, you know, wood or stone or, you know, a CV that's this thick? So I think recognizing the seriousness of it, I think repentance is critical, and then, you know, seeking to seek the Lord first, and to realize when we're trying to protect ourselves rather than let God do that.